5 miles from your house because of COVID. So we're pretty much stuck here, but it's not a bad place to be. Who is the Jesus of the Bible? And what we've heard and what Christians teach, is that accurate? Can we trust it? Is it fact or is it fiction? I'm not going to be assuming today that you believe in the Bible or that you believe in Jesus. In fact, I hope there are a lot of people watching this presentation who don't have faith, because I want you to see that it's actually reasonable to believe. Yes, Jesus is in the Bible. He's mentioned all over the New Testament and in a different sort of way all through the Old Testament. But what does the evidence actually show? Well, I'd actually like to begin with a passage in the Bible where Jesus is asking his disciples who people think he is. It says in Matthew 16 that he came to a region of Caesarea Philippi. It's like a retreat area, a very beautiful area where he was getting away with the disciples. His question is, who do people say the Son of Man is? Son of Man is the way Jesus referred to himself. And his disciples replied, well, some say you're John the Baptist, some say Elijah, others Jeremiah, one of the prophets. There are all these different views about who Jesus is. Even today, who is Jesus? Is it the Jesus of stained glass windows and establishment religion? Is it the Jesus that I was brought up with? At least the books I saw was basically a woman with a beard. He was very gentle. This may be a more familiar picture from movies, and movies are coming out all the time. Jesus is often imagined to be the same race as those who are preaching him. So you have a black Jesus, you have an Oriental Jesus, Asian Jesus, a white Jesus, a Che Jesus. People say, oh yeah, he was revolutionary, or maybe he was metrosexual, right? There are all kinds of Jesus images, and many of these are actually quite silly, but we have shown our ability as humans to make him in our own image. One prominent scholar, who I don't think understands the Bible very well, made a lot of money on a book called Zealot. And this author said that Jesus advocated violence to overthrow the Romans who have been occupying the historic land of Israel for many decades. And he was also trying to overthrow the corrupt priesthood. And he intended that the 12 tribes, that is somehow the Jews, be reconstituted for a single purpose, which was war. I've heard all kinds of theories about who Jesus was, because I speak broadly in many places of worship, not just Christian, but also I speak to Muslims, to Hindus, to Buddhists, to groups of atheists. I hear all kinds of ideas. We could spend all day looking at the different Jesuses, so to speak. What I like to do is keep it simple and look at evidence that is most certain. Returning to Matthew 16, after his disciples say that there are all kinds of ideas about who you are, Jesus says, what about you? He asked, who do you say I am? And hopefully, through the course of this presentation and the next, we'll be better able to answer that question of who Jesus is. Well, if we're looking at the Bible, he's the central figure of Scripture. There are actually 90 continuous chapters that focus on his life, and really, all 260 chapters of the New Testament focus on him, but especially we read about him from Matthew 1 to Acts 1. No one else appears as frequently in the Bible, more than 1,200 times. Now, the area where he worked was quite small. It was about 22,000 square kilometers or something like that, maybe 24,000, similar to the size of New Hampshire or Vermont. Globally speaking, it was a region less than 1% of the planet. But of course, small things are not necessarily bad things. His impact has been felt globally, even though the Middle East, and particularly the Eastern Mediterranean, where Israel is located, is quite small. Now, yes, he traveled on foot into what would today be Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, all around. It's still a very small area. But again, don't dismiss small things. What I'd like us to look at are four things, actually. We'll begin with basic biographical things, from his birth to his decision to remain celibate. Secondly, we'll look at who he was, who he looked like, what he looked like outside and inside. And then we'll shift to his ministry and message, and we'll end talking about his death. So let's begin right now with his birth, his family, his vocation, and his ministry. This is what Jerusalem looked like in the 1st century AD. Of course, he wasn't from Jerusalem. He was born near Jerusalem, but his family were in the north. They were in Galilee. Still, he came regularly to the south, to Jerusalem for the festivals. We know he was an observant Jew, even though he spent most of his time near the Sea of Galilee, which is still there today. And it's a pleasure, it's a real pleasure to go where Jesus went, to walk where Jesus walked. Well, when he was 2 years old, Herod the Great, who was the leader of Israel, really it was part of the Roman Empire, but he considered himself to be the king of the Jews. He was very threatened when he heard that the Messiah was born, that this king had been born, Jesus. And so he orders the execution of the little boys. This is called the slaughter of the innocents, because they were innocent. He orders the execution of all the toddler boys in the area of Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem wasn't very big then. This was probably, he was probably killing a few dozen little boys. But why would he do that? Because he didn't want someone prophesied to be the future king to challenge his kingship. And this is very much in line with what Herod the Great did, that we know from history, as he killed some of his own family members. He was not above killing his own sons. And so this man was paranoid. We know that from the record. This order to kill the babies in Bethlehem is known only from the Bible. But we don't need to dismiss it, because it is very much in line with what we know of Herod the Great. Herod died in 4 BC, and that's recorded by the Jewish historian and statesman Josephus. Now, Jesus himself was born clearly before the death of Herod the Great, the one who was trying to kill him. And that will help us to establish an approximate date for Jesus's birth in a moment. What do we know about the name Yeshua, which is what Jesus was called? Obviously, our word in English is not the original word. Our word actually is an adaptation of the Latin, which is an adaptation of the Greek. But Yeshua, it's basically the same figure as Joshua in the Old Testament, means something like God saves. Jesus is the word we see in the Greek New Testament. He is God with us, or with us God, Immanuel. That's who he is, but that was never his actual name. Interestingly, based on grave inscriptions and other literary sources from the 1st century in Palestine, we see that Jesus was one of the most common names. It was in the top 10. In fact, as you can see, Joseph and Mary are occupying 4th and 3rd place. There are actually quite a few. Just think of the millions of people who lived in the area. There are quite a few Josephs married to Marys. And there were families headed by Joseph and Mary who had at least one son named Jesus. So these are very common names. And these names that we see in the New Testament match perfectly with the inscription from graves and from literary sources. So we know that the New Testament is accurately reflecting the situation in the 1st century. It's not something that was written 1,000 years later and they try to make it seem historical. So Herod tried to kill the young boys because he died in 4 BC and Jesus would have been presumably 2 or under. Most scholars accept his birth year of about 6 BC. Well, how much historical evidence is required? Some people say, well, there's so little evidence for Jesus, you're just using the Bible to prove the Bible. Why should I believe it? Well, if you know much about history values sources, ideally eyewitness sources, but sources close to the events, and more sources, if they're good quality, the more sources, the better. Let me ask you a question. Who crossed the Rubicon? We have a saying in English that die is cast, which comes from words of Julius Caesar. The Rubicon was a river. And this is when there was no point, he had crossed the point of no return. He was marching on Rome. He wanted to be the dictator. We know a lot about Julius Caesar from his own writings, which if you ever studied Latin, you would have done that probably in Latin too. We know he was executed or assassinated really by the Senate. He was stabbed to death. Maybe you studied the play in English class, Shakespeare's play on Julius Caesar. We have no doubt of his existence, his impact. There's no reason to doubt that he crossed the Rubicon. And yet, there are no firsthand testimonies to that crossing. Caesar himself makes no mention in his memoirs about crossing any river. There are 4 historians in the next 2 or 3 generations who mention a Rubicon, and they say that Caesar crossed it. And here are their names if you want them. And all of these, apparently, these historians depended on one published eyewitness account. That is, if we go back. And that's of someone who lived 76 BC until AD 4. Unfortunately, that source has disappeared without a trace. No manuscript copies for any of these secondary sources are found earlier than a few hundred years after they were written. But that doesn't mean, well, we can't really know. When it comes to Christian sources, we're actually quite fortunate. Think of Tiberius Caesar. Okay, Julius was the dictator. He was the one who took all the power in himself. After his death, that jockeyed for power. Eventually, there was the empire, and his adopted nephew, Octavian, or Augustus Caesar, becomes the emperor. Now, after Augustus, Tiberius. And Tiberius was the emperor, the Kaiser, when Jesus lived and when Jesus was executed. The provincial prefect, the one in charge of Judea at that time, was a man named Pontius Pilatus, Pontius Pilate. We know about him too from archaeology. But just think of Tiberius for a moment. How do we know there was a Tiberius? Well, obviously there are monuments, but there are written sources. Let's consider the written references to Tiberius in the first 150 years after he died. Now notice, he dies in AD 37. So for Tiberius, we're looking from the late 30s to the 180s AD. And what do we find? We find that he's mentioned in 10 sources. You can see the years of his reign here. But he's mentioned in 10 sources. 9 of them are not Christian, and another one is Luke. How about Jesus? If we look 150 years from the time of his life, from his death in AD 30 to about 180 AD, 42 sources. 9 secular, 33 Christian sources. Not just in the Bible, because there are many other things that have survived, especially from the 2nd, 3rd century. And so when it comes to this kind of evidence, the existence of Jesus is on quite solid ground. I had the pleasure of spending a few years studying at the University of London. At that time, there was a professor in the German department who became very well known because he denied that Jesus ever existed. This is a very rare position. And he wasn't an historian, nor was he a theologian or a biblical scholar. He was a German professor. So I don't even know why he got so much TV time. One of the fellows I debated once wasn't sure whether Jesus existed. He called himself a Christian atheist. And he said, well, Jesus may not have existed at all. That is an incredibly rare position for anyone to take. In academia, scholars, well above 99%, 99.99% of all scholars would reject such skepticism as unnecessary. Well, what else do we know about Jesus? We know from the Gospels that he was from a large family. He was the first of 5 brothers. He was followed by 4 brothers, James or Jacob being the oldest, and these are all mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew. We also read that he had a number of sisters. We don't know the number, but it seems to be more than 2. So that would put Jesus in a family of 10, or maybe more. The last time his father is mentioned during a family visit to Jerusalem, in Luke 2, Jesus is only 12 years old. After that, we just don't know. We don't know when Joseph died. We know that he was not brought up with a silver spoon in his mouth because of the offering that the family made, which was an option, a sacrifice made when the child was born, but this was the option for those who could not afford a larger animal. You would just kill a pigeon. See the word I put after lifeline. I wrote speculative because I am speculating here. We begin with the date of his birth, the date that most scholars think is probably correct, although you'll find some disagreement. After Herod the Great died, the Gospels tell us that Jesus' family came back from Egypt. And so I'm assuming that sometime after that, Yaakov, that is Jacob or James, it's all the same word, was born. That is the next oldest brother. And Yosef and Judah, or Jude as we know him, Yosef is Joseph. We have the Luke 2 visit, we have Shimon being born, Yosef dying, which at some point would have made Jesus the eldest male, and that would have culturally required him to commit to certain commitments, certain behaviors. He begins his public ministry in the late 20s. He's probably about 32 years old. He's about 30, maybe exactly 32. We just don't know. But we do know if he was executed in the year 30, it would have been on the 7th of April. The alternative year is 33 AD, which puts him closer to 40. So most scholars don't accept that, but it's possible. But most scholars go with 30 AD. I think what you can see I'm doing here is I'm not preaching. I am trying to be careful with the evidence. And if I say anything that goes beyond the evidence, that is a speculation or just a guess, I want to let you know. Because Christians need to be people of truth. All of us need to be seekers after truth. We don't want to overstate the case nor understate it. We need to be careful. Also wanted to say a word about Jesus's vocation. His initial vocation was not Messiah. I don't think people asked him, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he said, I want to be Christ. I don't actually know what he thought, although there's indication that by age 12, he was figuring some things out. His father was described as a tecton. A tecton is a builder. A chief builder would be the architecton. Tectons worked with stone. They worked with wood. This is an actual carpenter in Nazareth. You can go there. It's a place called Nazareth Village where they do everything as they did in the first century. If you want to see what was their equivalent of a drill or a saw, or what was their hammer like, you can see. But this means that the family business involved manual labor. And we know in Jesus's ministry that he walked everywhere. We don't read about him being on a horse, except for maybe a very figurative passage in the book of Revelation. So this is someone who's tough. But his father does die earlier than the mother, and we never read of Joseph again after Jesus' age 12. So what happens those next 20 years? Well, Jesus has younger brothers, he'll have younger sisters, and as the eldest son, it makes sense that he would be providing for the family. And one reason would be the Bible not only expects us to be committed to our families, but also to look after widows. And his mother, Mary, would have been a widow after that point. Often people ask me, why did he wait? Why did he start his public ministry earlier? Why did he wait till he was in his 30s? Well, that's a fair question, although you could actually turn it around. What was he thinking starting so early? It's quite clear, even in the Gospels, like John chapter 8, that if you're not 40 or 50, you're still considered to be on the young side. And the older we get, the more we can understand that perspective. I think he delayed his ministry, if that's the correct word, because he had family responsibilities. And he wasn't trying to go through life easily without challenge. He was modeling for us how to be. Well, that's my opinion as a Christian. He never married. Why did he never marry? Well, maybe because he knew he was going to die. Maybe because he didn't feel a need to marry. He was righteous. So I've given you one reason, that the delay may be because he was simply taking care of his family and his mother. We see further that he didn't rush to begin his ministry. In fact, he seems to have had a very fine sense, a keen sense of divine timing. But what Jesus actually taught, which I'll tell you something that almost none of his followers teach, is that singles should remain single if they can. That's what the Bible says. That's what Jesus lived out and taught. It's what the Apostle Paul lived out and taught. And so we're not helping singles by teasing them into marriage, because the preferred path, if they have the gift, 1 Corinthians 7:7, is to remain single. Well, I don't want to get off topic here. I've shared a few thoughts about his birth, what we know of his family, what we know of the vocation of the tecton, and some thoughts about celibacy. I think you can see I'm not being very bold here, really trying to stick to the evidence. Let's talk about what he looked like, his appearance, and his character. Remember, Jesus was not white, he was not black, he was Asian. Israel's part of Southwest Asia. If you're Asian and you didn't know that Jesus was Asian, maybe you're feeling good, but he's definitely not European. I'm working on a book, well, actually, it'll come out soon, I hope. It's a book of prayers and includes some hymns. And one of the hymns, in one of the verses, talks about how fair Jesus was, his skin color and everything. And I had to remove that verse because it's totally nonsense. He wasn't white. He wouldn't have been fair. That would have distinguished him quite a bit if, unlike all the others in Palestine, he looked like someone from California. Average height at the time was about 5'6", about 168. I thought about Jesus' appearance quite a bit. In Mark 14, Judas, who's the apostle who defects and decides to have Jesus arrested for money, Judas is guiding the arrest party, to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus has just finished praying. This is around Passover time, and it's at night. That means there's a full moon. So in that garden, and actually a good part of that garden is still there today. Nothing like praying there. Maybe you get to do that one day. It's not obvious to the arrest party, or even to the high priest or the guards, which one they're supposed to arrest. So think of this. You have Jesus and a number of his disciples with him. It's not dark. It's actually quite bright. And even so, there had to be a signal. And Judas says, it's the one I kiss. So Judas the traitor goes and kisses him. If Jesus was a foot taller than everybody else, or if he had blonde hair, blue eyes, it would be pretty obvious. Oh, it's that guy, the guy who doesn't fit in. I think the issue is Jesus wasn't trying to, distinguish himself physically. It was all about the heart. I think he probably looked like the average Jew of the time. Yes, it's true. In a prophetic passage in the Old Testament, it says that he was disfigured, but this is probably talking about his passion. That is the period of his suffering leading up to his death, not talking about his normal appearance. So what did he look like? Average. How long was his beard? I don't know, but we do know that Jews in the 1st century AD were bearded, but they didn't wear their beards very long. The Romans would be clean shaven, the way I was until I turned 60. But he had a beard. And actually that was required. That was part of the Jewish law for a male to have a beard. So probably he was ordinary. And maybe that's good that we don't know what he looked like. Because if we knew his exact height, then all of us who were that height would say, I'm the height of Jesus, or, I'm built like him, or I have the beard he had, or the hair color. We're just not told. And usually when we're not told, it's because it's not important. Now, while we know a little about what he looked like, or maybe we know a lot about what he didn't look like, since he was ordinary, we know quite a bit about what he was like. That is, the kind of person he was. The Bible, in both Testaments, the Old Testament and the New Testament, when it comes to the major characters, it records their weaknesses. They all struggle with doubt, with faithlessness, with sin. with repentance. But we see weakness in all the major characters. Some characters make such a short cameo appearance, we don't know anything about their strengths or weaknesses. But I'm talking about the major characters. At no point, however, is sin attributed to Jesus. In the New Testament, the characters we know the most about are Jesus and the Apostle Paul. In the Old Testament, there'll be characters like Abraham, Moses, David, although there are dozens more. But sin is never attributed to Jesus, and even his enemies were not able to convict him of sin. He made them furious because he was right, because he wouldn't back down, maybe because he challenged the system. But he wasn't mean. He wasn't out of control. We understand that he would have felt temptation since he was a human being, and yet he resisted. And there are many passages in the New Testament that talk about his overcoming in that way. So we're looking at a person of integrity. Now, in one sense, none of his qualities stood out more than any other. I have an analogy. It's a really simple analogy. I can't see the sun today. It's a cloudy day in Scotland. The sun hasn't gone down yet. It'll go down actually in just a few minutes. But if you look at the sun, which is not normally advisable, you'll notice it's very bright. All parts are very bright. If I said, notice, my friends, look how bright the top left part of the sun is. You say the top left, that quadrant, that's just as bright as the bottom right. I mean, they're all bright. They're all brilliant. Yes, they're perfectly balanced. I think in the same way, with Jesus's qualities, it's easy to miss some of them because they're so strong. We forget, for example, his obedience to the Jewish law. He was Jewish. We forget, and this is not so much about the character, but it ties in to some extent. He would have dressed according to the law, the Torah. He would have spoken Aramaic. He would have observed the festivals. He would have had a good attitude towards law. And yet he would have lived in tension with pagan culture. He wouldn't have, it wouldn't be two sides to him where he would disobey the law in one context, obey it in another. He was obedient and gracious and very positive. Let me mention a couple of these qualities that we could miss. His intelligence and his intensity. When I say his intelligence, not just because he knew the scriptures, and he shows signs of great intelligence, even as a young man, as 12 years old, but he's also a student of human nature. As we read the Gospels, it's fun to see how his mind works, particularly when he's under pressure, when he's in a tight spot. Take a look and see that this man could think on his feet. This is not just street smarts. It's not just EQ or IQ. This is an intelligence which is extraordinary in any generation. And yet, even though he's brilliant, he never bullies others with that intellect. He remains humble as he interacts with others. And that's not always the case with people who may be educated beyond their intelligence or who may be very proud of themselves. What about his intensity? We often think of Jesus as very mellow, maybe because some of the movies that were made about him early on would have him only saying words that are in the New Testament. So he was very quiet. He would mainly just be quiet and very controlled and very chill. That's not the picture we get, though, in the New Testament. And we have different perspectives on his life, because Matthew's perspective on Jesus is a very different angle from Mark's or Luke's or John. Think of different camera angles. And Paul's experience of Jesus and his perspective is, again, somewhat different than the other writers. You put them all together, you get this three-dimensional, four-dimensional picture. But what we see in his character is not just a devotion to truth, integrity, but an intensity, the way he lives his life. It's stunning how much he could pack into one day and how he would keep going even if he was emotionally spent. At least he tried. This is something that I admire. I know some of you, you're in no danger of being called workaholics. And others, you thrive on work. Jesus was not a workaholic because that's a bit of a disorder, isn't it? He knew when to work and when to rest, but he was intense He was productive. His drive was phenomenal. And the New Testament invites those who follow him to lead zealous, passionate lives just as he did. That's the life to which Jesus called us. That's the life to which his followers and the apostles called it. That's what we read about when we read the Bible. And so if you're considering Christianity, but you're thinking just an add-in to an already full life, just to round you out, and that's not it. If you follow Christ seriously, you will be very focused and there will be that intensity. Okay, well, we're halfway through, at least my list of 4. I'd like us to make a shift now and talk about his ministry and his message. What do we know? And I hope you'll agree so far, these are things that we know. When I say he lives this life of intensity or he has intelligence, that's based on the different written sources about him. I didn't claim that he was omniscient. I haven't claimed that he's God. I've not even claimed the miracles. Of course, there are certain things that you really can't prove, although the miracles we read about make sense in light of the Old Testament. They make sense in light of Jesus' agenda, yet historians cannot prove those things. And I'm sticking to the basics here. What about that ministry and that message? Well, of course, some people say it's pointless to talk about his ministry or his message because he's just mythological, like that professor I debated once down in Houston. The problem with calling Jesus a myth, there are many problems with this. Myths are normally set in mythic time, long, long ago, far, far away, and you see all the mist dissipating, and you have this larger than life figure like Hercules or something. Jesus is not like that. His story is rooted in history. We know the names of the emperors when he lived. We know the names of the governors, the high priest. The Bible is full, in both Testaments, the Bible is full of verifiable historical information and geographical information. That's significant because the biblical story takes place in time and space. Thus, history and geography, which help us to understand what happened in time and space, those are important. Jesus's life, the whole story, it doesn't fit the mythological pattern. It's not set in mythic time. Unlike mythic heroes, Jesus seems to downplay his power. He tends to deflect his admirers. If you're a Christian and you've read the book of Acts, you had Simon the sorcerer who reveled in his power, and he wanted to be called the great power in Acts chapter 8. Jesus is nothing like that. He's not boastful. This is not, if you're an American, this is not Paul Bunyan and his Blue Ox Babe. This is not the Nordic god Thor or Odin. This is not Zeus. And thirdly, I would say the cross. And we can easily underestimate the shame of dying on a cross in the ancient world. The cross, the manner of his death is strongly at odds with the norms of mythology, simply because of the shame. One very well-known Latin writer of the 1st century BC, Cicero, said that being crucified is so horrible and shameful, it should never even be mentioned. It was a punishment that Roman citizens never had to endure, except perhaps for high treason. It was the way the throwaways were taught, were treated, perhaps slaves or people who commit crimes. And in the ancient world, this idea of human rights and the dignity of all people, that doesn't exist, right? That's a contribution of Judaism and Christianity. In the 1st century AD, that's not the way people think. Anyway, he doesn't seem to fit the pattern of myth. However, people keep teaching that Christianity has borrowed from other religions. Zeitgeist, the movie, came out online. It was an internet movie that came out many years ago. And it was pretty well done, except most of what it said was nonsense. But since most people haven't read the Bible or they don't remember history, they got sucked in. And now there's a Zeitgeist 2, I understand. But Zeitgeist claimed that Jesus wasn't the only one who had 12 disciples and who was born of a virgin and died and rose from the dead. And I don't want to take a lot of time on this. I learned about the so-called parallels when I was doing my master's degree. During the 2 years, I lived in New England, in Cambridge. Well, there are parallels, but they're not very good parallels. One, often it's said that, well, like the Egyptian god Horus, he had a virgin birth. But that's not right, because Isis wasn't a virgin. Often you'll see pictures of Isis holding Horus. It's like Madonna and child. But about the most I can say for the parallel is there was a mother and a child. It's one of the most common themes in the world. Or they say, well, the Attis, who's another figure, existed because Zeus spilled his semen on a mountain. So there was no woman involved. And that's supposed to be like a virgin birth. Sometimes they say Krishna was born of a virgin, but they forget that Diwali, his mom had 7 children first, and on and on. The idea that there are other crucified gods is just nonsense. Even the idea that there were gods who died and came back falls short, because normally the death and resurrection, so-called, of the ancient gods was tied into the agricultural cycles. So they would die every year as the ground grew dry, or as things froze. The god dies, maybe visits the underworld, and in the spring, as everything comes to life again and everything's green, then he comes back. But these are not deaths for us men and our salvation. This is not bearing sin. This is annual. It's not a once for all sacrifice, and it's agricultural. It's tied into reproduction and crops and sex and so forth. So when people say, well, there are all these parallels, they're really very poor. And we could take time and go through these if we had more time. Jesus knew from scripture that the Jews expected someone to come before the Messiah. He identified this fellow as John the Baptist, who's referred to in the Old Testament. So there was a forerunner, someone who came before him. We also know a lot of the thinking about the Messiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I've just selected a couple of things here. I mean, there are all kinds of insights. Maybe you'd like to listen to my podcast on the Dead Sea Scrolls. But these writings were written before the time of Jesus. And they have survived 2,000 years, which is amazing. We see, for example, in the document 4Q246, that's document 246 from cave number 4 at Qumran, that the Messiah was going to be the Son of God and the Son of the Most High. And in another manuscript from that same cave, that when the Messiah comes, heaven and earth would obey him. The dead would be raised, the sick would be healed, the oppressed would be rescued. So Jesus, when he comes to this world, he's fulfilling not just Old Testament prophecy, but common expectation among the people. Oh, I wish I could go into this more. People are just unaware how much evidence there is. But when Jesus comes, I think many people realized he is the one. See, after his baptism, he was baptized by John the Baptist in the river. And then the temptation, he embarked on a teaching ministry that's probably 3 years. In John's gospel, we learn that he returned to Jerusalem for 3 Passovers. And so that suggests a ministry of 3 or maybe 3.5 years. And if he began work in 27 or 28, by the chronology of Luke, he would have been executed in 30. Now, he started in the north, in Galilee, and he worked among the towns of present-day Lebanon and Syria, Jordan, and of course, Israel. He comes to Jerusalem occasionally for the festivals, but he doesn't take on the powers that be until the end of his ministry. In the north, you can still, you can visit the synagogue at Capernaum, at least the structure that's erected above the original foundations. There are many places in the Holy Land where we can walk where Jesus walked, because these are real places. Now, his ministry included several components: proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, teaching, healing, driving out demons, training, and offering his life for the sins of the world. His central message was the kingdom of God. Whereas his contemporaries expected, among the Jews, they expected that at the end of time, the kingdom would come. The present age would then become that future age, the age of the Messiah, Jesus said, actually, that future age is dawning right now. So in Christianity, we understand there's an overlap of the present age and the age to come. And we live in that overlap period. This was a radical thought, but that's what he taught. And it's clear reading the Gospels that the central message was about the kingdom. The message wasn't about his death on the cross, although that's an important part of the message of the kingdom. And the gospel is certainly not repent and be baptized. That's not even part of the gospel. That's part of the response to the gospel. So forgiveness and freedom and participation in a better life brought by the Messiah are available now. This is what Jesus was teaching. And those truths were difficult to grasp at that time because of presuppositions. They may be difficult for us too. One very colorful New Testament professor at Vanderbilt says of Jesus, he's the only person I can find in antiquity, that is in the ancient world, who says you have to love your enemy. Amy Jill Levine is interesting, not just because she's a great teacher, but also because she's Jewish. But she admits that Jesus is the only one in the ancient world who said you can't kill your enemy. And that indeed is what Jesus taught, even though most people who claim to follow him now disagree. We also see, in terms of his ministry and his message, two sides. We see the lion of the tribe of Judah, that's based on a prophecy from Genesis, and we see the lamb that was slain. That's another prophecy in Isaiah. And we learn in the book of Revelation that the lion and the lamb are actually the same figure. Jesus is both. And if we latch only onto the lion's side, we get a lopsided view of him and his power and his royalty. If we only focus on the lamb's side, the suffering, we're missing something too. There are actually two sides of a messianic coin, you could say. He also taught that his followers are not just to revere him, but to follow him. And he calls us to a radical standard of holiness, higher than that standard that is expected by the establishment. If you want a very simple way to look at his teaching to us, look at what he says about being disciples. In the Gospel of John, it says there are three things. First, we remain in his word. We hold to his teaching. Secondly, his true followers will love one another. And he showed us how to do that. And third, we'll live productive lives. We'll bear fruit that lasts. These are the three passages in John's Gospel that explicitly say what a disciple is. And those are passages we should use when we teach our friends, if we're Christians. Well, this brings us to the final section of the presentation. I'm going to share a little bit of this, and I'll do the rest of it at the beginning of next time. So far, we've talked about his message and his ministry, his appearance, his character, his birth, and so forth. His death is not in doubt. There's only one group, let's say mainstream Muslims would say that he wasn't killed, that it looked like it might be him, but he was actually taken up to heaven. But of course, that opinion from Muhammad is 6 centuries after Jesus's death, and there's no strong reason to believe that that's true. If we look at the end of his life, what's called the Passion Week, of course, begins with a triumphal entry on Sunday, what is called Palm Sunday. You had the week of the Last Supper, you've got the flogging, you've got the crucifixion. Resurrection would have been the Sunday after that. And then you have the Ascension, and then you have Pentecost when the Spirit is given. So we have particular dates if 30 AD is the correct year. So his passion, it wasn't just dying on the cross, it was more, and it was more than just physical pain. It's a rejection and a darkness and a loneliness for someone who never deserved it. Scholars are in agreement he died. And why would the Christians make up his death on a cross if he didn't die on a cross? Because in the Roman world, that's just shameful. It'd be like saying, yes, I'm part of a new religion. Who's your founder? Oh, well, he's a child molester according to the prisons and the courts, but we actually think he's a great guy. I mean, you would never make up something like that. If anything, you would downplay it. Whereas the cross is central, even though it's shameful, it's central to understanding God and his relationship to us. There are there are several things that are agreed upon by nearly all scholars. And when I say nearly all, I mean, if you take 5,000 of them, 4,000, well over 4,000 will agree with these three facts. One, that he was crucified. Two, that he was buried somewhere. And three, that he appeared, or at least people believed he appeared. People had experiences of seeing him after his death. They claimed not that he was a ghost. Ooh, I'm frightened because he's dead. Actually, the opposite, that he was alive, not a ghost in I don't believe in ghosts personally, but in popular mythology. But they had an experience of him after death. Now, you could be an atheist and still affirm all these. Jesus was executed, he was buried, and then sometime soon after, people believed they saw him. Of course, if you're an atheist, you might say, well, they were mistaken. Although there are some who would say that perhaps he did rise from the dead. And so this is where I want to leave us right now. We're going to begin next time looking at some of the ancient evidence for his death and the implications of this. And we'll also have time for some questions. Now, I'm not going to do these slides right now. All I'm doing is fast forwarding just a little bit here. There we are. I will take questions in the next session. So I'll finish off part 4. And if you have questions on Jesus, fact or fiction, you'll email them to Tom Caswell, who introduced me, and he'll explain more in just a moment. But thank you for listening to part 1 of this presentation on Jesus.